And I am a California SeaGrant Fellow with the Water Board's Office of Information Management and Analysis. And for this data science workshop, we just kind of wanted to give you a run through of what data science is and how you can get involved in becoming your own data scientist. So data science, I think for a lot of people might seem a little bit scary, but really it's just a combination of the math and statistics, computer science, and subject matter expertise. And once you kind of get all of those things in one person, that's your data scientist. In the data science community, they're often referred to as unicorns, so keep that in mind. And so again, data and data science, when you use them together and use them together well, you can, like Eric said, communicate information. And this can be through storytelling, statistical inference, so something is significantly impaired or not, or better or worse or whatever. You can make predictions, and as you'll see later today, you'll also be able to make visualizations, which I think are the most powerful way of communicating data to all audiences. If you have a pretty image, people can really connect to that pretty easily. So first, I wanted to use data from a community water science group, and so the examples that I will be showing you were provided by the Alpine Watershed Group, and so I just wanted to acknowledge their contributions there. The most, I think, important thing to think about when you're trying to think about data and data science is the data lifecycle. And Melissa talked about this a little bit before. And I think it's from classical training, a lot of us, you go out and you collect your data and then you do stuff. And that's all you really need to think about, right? But in order to really effectively communicate your data into information, it's critical to think about, before you even collect your data, what are you going to use it for? And how are you going to collect it in a meaningful way? And then once you collect it, how are you going to analyze it and pre-process it and clean it? And then for longer term things, how are we going to store it? Maybe make it open to the public or share it with collaborators and things like that. And then ideally, the life cycle is circular, so you go through one cycle and then you learn things and then you revise your process and make the process better and keep getting better and better data as you progress. So I wanted to go over a couple of key data science terms and concepts so that when you leave this room, you will be able to go into data science with confidence and start to explore what that will look like for you. And so data, as we're all familiar with, is the stuff that you collect. So these are the things that you measure in the field or in the lab. The metadata is the data about your data. So who collected it? What did you collect? When was it collected? Where was it collected? Are there certain things about maybe certainty that you want to associate with your data? And for all the nerds out there, that's data laughing at a metadata joke. Another thing is to think about human readable data, which is the stuff on forms. And so this is the quality data sheet that was provided to me, and the top portion is usually where all your metadata is. So the stuff that you collect at the beginning of a survey to remind you of who to talk to and there's a question about what happened that day. And then all the measurements below that are the data themselves. Having that form and collecting that data is important, and it's a crucial step, but in order to do data science, it needs to become machine readable. And so this means it's something like a CSV, a JSON file, or an XML. I think a lot of us are probably more familiar with something like Excel, right? And so that's easy to get to a CSV, but the key difference there is with Excel, if you save things as a CSV and you use things like color to indicate information, all of that is stripped away. And so you want to make sure your data is tidy. And this means that all of the information that you want to collect is recorded in its own cell or column. And by going through that extra step and keeping your data clean and tidy, I feel like Michelle Kondo, whatever her name is, it's much easier to create these cool visualizations and analyses and products that we all want to get to in the end. So for tidy data, like I said, each variable should be in its own column. The observation should be in its own row. The data set should be in its own table. So, and we can talk about what a data set is for like years. So if you have questions, come talk to me after. And then if you have multiple types of information that you're collecting, you would relate those tables through a unique identifier or something like that. So on the bottom right here is a very short example of what a tidy data set would look like. So you have your month and your site number and your date and your conductivity, and that could keep growing and have more and more and more columns. So another thing to think about is the structure of your data. So a lot of us that have worked in Excel files and spreadsheets and things like that are used to what's known as a wide data set. And so these data are usually easy for humans to understand and easy for us to read and kind of get the information we need very quickly. And in Excel, if you're trying to create graphs, it's easier to do that in the wide data structure. But when we do a lot of data science and visualizations, the computers prefer long data sets. And so this means that you'll notice in the middle of in the table up here, you have 3 records of pH, right? So pH 1, pH 2, pH 3. In a long data structure, you might just have one column for pH and another column for replicate, and then you create a longer version of your data table. And usually when people are being first introduced to wide versus long data, at least when they interact with me, it's like, okay, sure, I want to use this. How the heck do I get all my wide data into long data? That's going to take ages, and it's going to be horrible. Manually, yeah, you're right. That's true. It'll take a long time, potentially. But by using coding programs like R that David's going to talk about in a minute, there are tools or programs already implemented in there for you that can make that process much easier and much faster. So converting from wide to long data does not have to be a scary and horrible task. So as fun as it is to make these visualizations, a really critical part is having your data tidy and clean, like we were talking about. And there's a joke amongst the data science community that 80% of the time data scientists are cleaning the data, and the other 20% they're complaining about having to clean the data because it takes a lot of time. And, you know, it's not necessarily the most sexy part of data science, but to get to the cool part, you need to kind of plan this data cleaning process into your time. And so this is a figure from a Forbes study that was out in 2016. They interviewed, I think, 80 data scientists, and they spent about 80% of the time cleaning their data. So I'm not going to go through this checklist. This presentation will be provided after the symposium, but if you're interested in learning the beginning of what data cleaning might look like, I have this checklist printed on my desk. So every time I'm going through a data set, I'm like, okay, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to check for these things. And you know, it's you can make these processes easier through your data collection time. So knowing ahead of time what a 0 means versus what an NA means versus what a blank cell means, those sorts of things, having those conversations in the beginning makes the later stages much simpler. So this is just kind of like a crash course in data cleaning. And we'll have more resources at the end of the slide so you can pursue that further. And here it is. So the resources at the top are just links to, learning more about what data science is, if this has not put you to sleep, learning what tidy data is, and converting from wide to long format using our statistical software. And there's a link to that article. Some data tools that are really common, we're going to be going over some today. The majority of them can be open sourced. So things like using the R statistical programming language or Python, Jupyter Notebook, and then we'll also be talking about Tableau and Microsoft Power BI as visualization tools. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to my next teammate, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the session.
One question.
So you're all going to be like, go home and be like, guys, I'm a data scientist now. Yeah, so
Will the PowerPoint be available so I can get the link?
Yes, so we'll be posting this online and everything that was linked. You mean you couldn't see the URL between? No. Yeah, so everything will be posted after the session and you'll have access to it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yes?
So if being a data scientist is so great, why isn't everybody a data scientist?
That's a good question. And I think part of it is sometimes there's a big learning curve to learn these open source tools like R and Python. But for me personally, that's only one piece of being a data scientist. And I think we kind of need to have a culture shift where we all kind of think of ourselves as scientists, data scientists and data stewards of whatever we're doing, and learn how to do the best that we can. Of course, not everyone can know everything, right? That's why we have technical support and things like that. But by knowing the base of data science, you'll be able to kind of be empowered to use your data a bit better. So to be the super cool, colorful unicorn data scientist, you might have to take some classes. There are degrees in data science, but you don't have to necessarily go through that whole process to have an understanding of what data science is and empower yourself to use the tools that are available. Okay, Bev, we'll talk about Power BI.
Science is all about, right?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bev Anderson. I'm also with the Office of Information Management Analysis. And Anna gave us a nice description of how to deal with your data and how to make it clean and get it to a point that we can use it. For the rest of us, what we're going to talk about is how can you start looking at your data? And I've titled my little talk, Exploring Data in Power BI. I'm not going to get us to a point where it's pretty visualizations. It's like, what can Power BI do, and how can you start thinking about the data that you're working with? We've got a ton of data out there. Sometimes it's a little overwhelming. So some of these tools with something like Power BI, you can start to get a picture of what your data can show you, or you really have to look in and figure out, what's the story behind this. So with Power BI, how many of you have ever used Excel? So Power BI is a platform that's built on Excel. It's a Microsoft platform. So if you've used Excel and you've used Excel, work with it in various different ways. When you start working in Power BI. Up here it has a Get Data button. Pull data from a lot of different has a table of data that you're interested in. Of an old PDF file. All those PDFs that you think, God, I've got to retype all this data. I fairly quickly and once you have your data into this, and you can see there's scatter plot or anything else. I've got a couple of mapping visualizations. This is right out of that. And this is exciting because up till about 2 weeks ago, we had to pull down a shapefile. It just goes in directly, and so you can. Most of what I do is working with water board, and a lot of it is, number of inspections. First thing I do is pull in the latitude, longitude, and find out where all of the wells are. If I were to look at that in an Excel file, I can really quickly put a filter on. And I'm settling down to and I apologize. If I hover over any of those dots, I can see what the lat long is, and I can see not only the bigger and darker the dot is, the higher. Look at is what's the land use. As I'm connected to ArcGIS, I can pull in land use data. Also pull up some demographic information. I've got access access to all of this stuff directly through this connection. I'm sorry. I knew I would do that. Sorry about that. And then, because we're with the water board, for those of you who are here, with this direct connection, we can go into the ESRI portal that the water board has. So in this case, I knew I was working with Region 5 data. I wanted to see if there was anything Region 5 had in the area, so I can pull in their shape files for their priority water basins. And sure enough, this Fresno area is a priority basin for Region 5. So I've got a lot of data now that I didn't have 5 minutes ago. Now, one thing I notice here is there's this big cluster of wells that's not in a priority basin. I don't know what's going on over there. I do know that I'm interested in drinking water. So I'm going to focus on some specific kinds of wells. The data set that I had has information about whether it's a municipal well, a domestic well, or an unknown well. So I can filter that, and I find that all of those, that big cluster that was over here just vanishes. So those were all agricultural irrigation wells, some landfill monitoring wells, some USGS wells, things that maybe I'm not super interested in right now, thinking about drinking water. And now my data set that I need to be concerned about is down to this. And that's a much more manageable data set where you can start looking at the numbers. Once I've got something like this, I can start throwing it into graphs. I can start looking at things. I can start analyzing the data within Power BI and start playing around with stuff like this. So here, really quick, I put my filter back off up here, but this is the municipal groundwater data, or groundwater wells with the nitrate data. And you can start seeing some patterns here. What are the wells that we need to be concerned about? The nice thing about having things like this, I've got a filter on it that filtered us at 10. Maybe we want a little bit more conservative approach and we want to look at anything that's 8 or higher. All I have to do is go up and change this filter and play around with things there. So I can move things around, I can change things very quickly and easily to start exploring this data and make some amazing visualizations. I don't know what my time is like. I could go to the Power BI site and show a few things, but I think I ran out of time on this, so if there's any questions.
Unfortunately, your 15 minutes are up.
Yes, I know. I looked at the...
Thank you.
Okay.
Next up is Rafa. Thanks, Bev. Bev could spend hours and hours on this because it's that demonstrative. Great tool. You guys like that? Yes. You guys that are remote, you send us an email. Let us know if you'd like to participate. Rafa's been doing some really awesome.
So I want to talk about the technology that we have today to analyze and visualize it. Years ago, if you wanted to build a map, then you want to publish on the web. Then you had to have your web support people to actually do the coding of how to publish it. Well, the tools that we have today allow us to close the cycle. We can do everything ourselves. We don't need we don't depend on other departments or divisions, at least at the water board, to build these visualizations. because we are the citizens monitoring group, I wanna start by showing you an example of something that I put. It took me like probably 10 minutes to put together, but because it's relevant to this group, which is the map of all the citizen monitoring groups. And this is live. As Webb was showing before, so it's like a simple map that you can see where all these the locations for monitoring groups, and you hover over and you have information for that one. So you look for that watershed, and you're interested in working with that group. This is the group that you can work with. There's also another thing here that is very useful, if I can get to it, which is you can actually download the data. So you want that list. Sorry. I haven't tried this so you can go here, click the data, and you have that list of all the sites, of all the voluntary groups. And you can just download it, you can go to the full data, and you can just go and copy and download it. Okay, you can show all columns, you can download all the rows. So this is not just a way of visualizing information, but it actually is open data. And I want to talk a little bit about open data because 2 years ago there was a bill that was passed because it was called AB 7055. It's called the Open and Transparent Water Data Act that requires the Water Board, the Department of Water Resources, Fish and Wildlife, and the Monitoring Council to release all the data sets in an open data format, in machine readable, something that Anne was talking before. Why? Because it's not just we have the data, we are hiding it. We want to make sure that everybody has access to that data and they can do their own analysis. So then what can we do with this data? What do you guys want to see? You want to see a map? You want to see some interaction? Because this is real. I mean, by the way, all this is available on the web, so anybody can access it and look at it. I have like 200 of these visualizations. Because my project is to let me show you what you can do with your data. So if you have data, I can show you what is possible. The technology that we have today to reveal this information that it was hiding before. And now we can see the insights and we can make decisions based on that. Because we're doing water quality monitoring, this is, for example, beach water quality information. Very similar to what Will was showing, you have a map. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Okay, so you can apply filters, you can click on any station, and the data down below will show the data. Let's see if I can find one that has something. So these are all the locations where a monitoring will occur. I can find one that has more than one data point. No luck. Anyway, you can change your analytes, you can put all the analytes there. The same thing. You can say more than one point. You can just say a group of them like this, and it shows you the data for all those points. And then you can just look at the range of values. So I think it's a very powerful tool to identify trends and patterns, spatial and temporal. Let me see if I have another one. This one is also a beach water quality. And this is bacteria, Enterococcus. I'm an economist, by the way, so I don't really know exactly the chemistry of these things, but I know data very well. So these are just like, you can click on any particular station. You can actually look at the different beats. I think I have here. You can go statewide. You can put all the data for all the states, for all the stations. So you can navigate your data. This is all the bacteria data that we've been collecting since 1998 for the entire state. And it looks like this. These are all the data points. I think there are like 3 million records. So now we are visualizing in one single location 3 million data points. Doesn't mean much. I mean, you have to really filter for a particular station to be more meaningful. You click on any one of them. But it gives you an idea of what is possible. Okay. So you have your threshold, and you can see if it's safe to swim or not. So you answered that question that we were having before about what are the management questions that we want to answer. So what is interesting is about exploring the data. One thing is that we realize at the water board that we all use data one way or another. I mean, we're all working with data every day, but not everybody has the data science skills to actually to maximize the use of that data. And this is one of the things that we are working on, bringing this technology, these tools to the staff. And the same thing with the voluntary groups, that actually you can use your own data to make your own decisions. Any questions?
Graph you have there is
this is the 30-day average. So this is the rolling average. The dots are individual data points, because the limit is based on the geometric mean of the Enterococcus. It's the 30-day average of the geometric mean, and that's why it's calculated. So you see the calculated values and then the threshold.
Could you wait for the microphone, please?
Yes. So by the way, you can see the actual beach and the actual station where the beach was. And it's one random, nothing, was not prepared.
so not all data is comparable, right? So if you're
Right.
pulling all these data from various sources, there are different methods, different thresholds, different detection limits that are used. Is there a way to select data that are more comparable than others, or is it just?
Correct. So those are the filters or the criteria. You have those qualifiers. You can always filter for those. So you can remove the ones you don't want. I mean, it's as simple as having that additional attribute in your data set, so you can filter for it.
So this is really cool stuff, by the way, but I think, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but a really important part of data science in general is reproducibility and tracking workflows and collaborative projects. And I'm just curious, what capacity does something like Tableau or even Power BI have to speak to reproducibility and working with others?
Okay, so one of the things that I particularly like about Tableau is that it's, in a way, it's open source and open data. So you can come here and you can download the if I can here. So you can download the file that I used to create. So when you download it, you have exactly the same tool that I have. So with that, you have the data, you have the code, and then you can reproduce it any way you want it. So it's open source and open data, which is what we're looking for.
Do you have time to do another real life one? Because we just recently found in our area old dry cleaners. And we worked with another agency and they kind of started the process. But does that mean all of you guys link together?
That's one of the things that we're working on data interoperability and data integration. So bringing the data from multiple different sources and speaking the same language. That's why we're trying to work with data dictionaries that are, kind of the same. I mean, what we found is, like, for example, at the water board, we have 5 different programs that do water chemistry, and they all have different data dictionaries. So they call copper differently and things like that, and it's very hard to bring them all together.
So could you pull up real quick Vallejo, Solano County and see what comes up under dry cleaners?
For the beach water quality, or?
No. Because that's beach water,
This is
right?
just beach water quality.
So can you pull up dry cleaners for Solano County? Because I know it's documented through the water board.
Yeah, but that will be a different data set. I think I have something like that, but I can get back to you later if you want.
So you can't do that real quick right now.
I have something like that because I've done it, but I will have to look for
This
it.
data set's composed of fecal indicator bacteria only.
Mhm. Yeah, this is fecal.
Yeah. That's why.
Yeah, this is kind of related to the other question that was asked, is you selected all the counties and
Correct.
have a single graph that shows over time what these, statewide values are. But that's with the assumption that all the counties are producing data that has been evaluated for the compatibility of its metadata, essentially. So I think that might be something that's missing in this, is when you look at that, you see some kind of statewide pattern, but it could be apples and oranges. We don't know because we don't see that back end evaluation of, all of those sources and how they were compared and who made that decision and that kind of thing.
Correct. The reason I was speaking on the beach water quality is because we have a very robust data set and it has several years of data, the monitoring program that they have, and it's focused on 3 parameters. So it's actually easy to track. But we have from SeaGrant and SWAMP and the monitoring programs, we have more visualizations that actually show for any monitoring station pesticides or any other parameters that we're monitoring for. So we can actually assess trends. I have another one for mercury. And I have, there are many ways. Once you have the data, displaying it it's a matter of formatting the data, to do transformations that you need to do, like Anna was talking about, making it long instead of wide and things like that. Yeah. Yeah.
You have all, you look.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Who is it back in that compares?
Maybe you can answer that question about the beach water.
Beach water quality, but just in general.
Oh, comparing the assessing the quality of the data? The data users, yeah. The counties are collecting this data. It's a county program.
Right, so you're assuming that they've done every other.
Correct. So this has to be analyzed at the laboratory that has to be certified for bacteria, and then they submit the data, the laboratory submit the data to the counties. Yeah.
I mean,
Anything, yeah. Same thing. But ideally, we should have the qualifiers about each record, each monitoring point, each data set. Yeah.
So that's a really great point, and that kind of comes back to your data lifecycle. And as someone that collects the data, and when you're collecting data sets from people other than you that have collected it, kind of taking the time to think about the certainty behind the data and how the different methodology was used. And so that's part of the whole data science, data lifecycle process. I think that was just an example of one data set. But that's a really great point that everyone should really think about when you're downloading data from somewhere. Don't necessarily just assume that it's 100% perfect and doesn't have issues. People should be adding qualifiers in and indicating, what things people should be looking at in terms of uncertainty and things like that in their data set. So that's a really good point to the bigger data science question.
So when you download this data set, you will see that it's a lot of attributes, that it's not just Enterococcus 100. It's going to give you all the information associated with that monitoring point. Who did it, when, how, what frequency, what station. So it has what laboratory. So all the metadata goes with that particular data point.
thank you, Rafa.
Our final presentation of this technical series is by David. He's going to be talking about using data in R. Can you just start by telling me what is R?
All right, well, that will be the first slide. So, so I'll be talking about using data in R. Obviously, that's a pretty big topic to cover in just about 10 minutes. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple. Sorry if it's a little too basic for some of you, if you already know some of it, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is R, as Eric mentioned, and then why you might want to use it, and then a really quick example of how you might use it. So what is R? First and foremost, it's a programming language, for better or worse, and for all that entails. Importantly, it is free and open source, so if you have a computer and a way to download something from the internet, you can use it, and you always will be able to because it's open source. It's primarily sort of designed around the idea of doing data analysis, so there's a lot of features that make it useful for that, and it's kind of a little bit of a unique programming language in that a lot of people that use it aren't necessarily computer scientists or programmers. It's, as far as I know, usually used by scientists and engineers and even journalists. So it's really kind of designed so that you can use it even if you don't know all the deep concepts of computer science and things like that. I certainly don't, and I use it a little bit. So it's useful in really all the phases of a data science workflow. I think sometimes there's kind of a misconception that it's only useful if you're doing really complex statistics, but there's actually a lot of good tools that are useful for sort of the end-to-end process from kind of the mundane data cleaning and manipulation tasks all the way through doing graphical display. And it does, of course, have a lot of complex computational power. It's widely used in academia, government, and in industry, which is basically to say that even though it's open source and it's free, you can really trust the quality of the software. You don't have to worry about that. And finally, it's very highly extensible via something called packages. If you're familiar with Excel, you can kind of think of those as being like add-ins, and that they just sort of add extra functionality. One example that's been developed kind of recently that's really useful is called the tidyverse. It's kind of built on that philosophy of tidy data that Anna talked about earlier. And I'll show a quick example of using that later. I also just wanted to make a quick note. There's another programming language called Python that you've probably heard of. It's kind of equally used for data science in comparison to R. Sometimes there's sort of a debate about which is better. I really don't have an opinion, but just wanted to note that pretty much everything I say here also applies to Python. So why might you want to use R? All these bullet points could really be discussions in their own, so I'm just going to kind of fly through it. Like I mentioned, it's free and it's open source, so that's a big plus. There's a lot of analytical power, like I mentioned, for the whole data science workflow. Importantly, it's great for reproducibility and great if you're concerned about transparency and collaboration because everything is scripted. And like I said, everything, kind of the whole end-to-end process can be scripted out. So you can pass along a script to somebody else, and you sort of always have that very explicit sort of recipe of what you've done. It's great for version control. It's compatible with things like Git and GitHub, if you're familiar with that, sort of outside of the scope of this talk. But it's also scalable, so if you're working with large data sets, you don't run into some of those problems that you might have with Excel, just not being able to load all the data or having it go really slow if you're doing a lot of complex computation. There's a really active user community that's really supportive and inclusive, so you can get a lot of help. Again, even though it's a free software, there's lots and lots of help available. And there's sort of constant innovation, like I mentioned, via those packages that sort of extend the functionality. And then finally, it's a really flexible tool. It is a code-based tool, so there's tons of things that I don't have time to cover that you can do with it to automate processes and do interactive web applications and things like that. So finally, just so you don't feel like you have to take my word for it, I wanted to point out a paper that kind of describes a group that's using a lot of these tools to develop something called an ocean health index. And so they have this figure here that kind of shows how going over time by adopting a lot of these tools that I mentioned in the text in the figure, their ease of reproducibility and ease of collaboration went way up. And with the size of the circles indicating the time that they spend, that went way down, so they could focus more on things like the science or the policy or whatever they may be interested in. So how do you actually use R? First, I wanted to point out that there's something called R Studio, which is also free and open source, that kind of gives you an interface with R that makes it a lot easier to work with. So this is just sort of a screenshot of what it looks like if you open it up on your computer. You get sort of your place where you enter the code, but you also have a text editor to write scripts. You can look at all of your variables saved. You can look at plots. There's tons of other stuff like a lot of help documentation built in, tools for documentation built in, lots of things that I don't really have time to cover, but some of them are written down here if you want to check those out later. And so finally, wanted to run through a quick example using that same data set that Anna talked about earlier from the Alpine Watershed Group. So the data is in this Excel workbook. You can see it's kind of formatted, in sort of a typical, it's probably formatted in a way that works great for doing an analysis in Excel. It's not necessarily the way I might want to work with it in R. So what I'm going to do is try to take it and format it into a more usable kind of style, and then make some quick plots with it. So first, if I were working with this data, I'd, like I mentioned, load up a couple of those packages that give me some extra functionality, and then just import the data into R. So that's a simple, just one-line command where you just point it to where the data set lives on your computer. In this case, I'm just going to read in the data from one sheet to keep it simple. You could do all the sheets or a subset of the sheets. And then in RStudio, you have this functionality to view your data, and you get sort of this spreadsheet type view. And you can see it looks pretty similar to what was in the Excel spreadsheet. There's some blank cells, there's some summary data that's kind of embedded in there. So really now what I'd want to do is just pull out the raw data. So there's a bit of code here. I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is the code that would help me to extract the data, so kind of the raw data from that sheet. And I just wanted to point out there's a few things in here, especially if you're using that tidyverse sort of set of packages that I mentioned, that make your code at least somewhat readable, even if you're not that familiar with R. So you can see there's these kind of verbs that are used as the functions. Like here, I'm just filtering out everything where the date is missing. And then I'm going to simplify some of the column names just to make them easier to work with in R. Make sure that the date field is working correctly, that it got imported. All right. And then finally, just selecting the columns that I want that have the raw data. So that's, again, there's a select verb there that does that. And then if I look at that data, now it looks hopefully a lot cleaner. It just has the raw data that we want. So now I'm going to try to convert it into that tidy format that Anna talked about earlier. So again, there's a great tool in R that does that really with basically one line, this gather function. So you basically just tell it what columns you want to work with. And then if I look at that, now you can see that what used to be the column titles for all the different analytes are now in this measure column. And then the value is in its own column associated with that. So now there's one other thing that I'd want to do here. You can see that the measure field actually has two pieces of information embedded in it. The excuse me, the analyte and the replicate. So I want to split those out into their own columns. So again, just one line to do that, separate. And now you can see I've got a column for analyte and a column for replicate, and then a column for the value. So now I can really easily summarize that data. So just do a command that's grouping everything by site ID, date, and analyte, and then summarizing to get the average value. So now I've got a pretty clean data set with all that summary data, where it's just one line for a site ID, date, analyte, and the average value of those three readings. The last thing I want to do is plot the summary data for each analyte, and then throw in some linear trend lines just to kind of see if there's any trends that we might see. So I'm using another package here that's pretty popular called ggplot2. Looks maybe a little bit complicated if you haven't seen it before, but basically I'm just saying what's the data set, what do I want to put on the X and Y axes, then give me points and lines, and then throw in a linear trend line and labels, and then split everything out by the analyte. So I get a couple of charts for each analyte. So I showed everything here kind of piecemeal, one step at a time, but really the power is that you can save all this into one script file, and then you can rerun it as needed. You know, if your data changes, or if you realized, oh, you made a mistake in one line or something, that you need to go back and edit, you can very quickly just click a button and rerun it, and it's all, it basically redoes your whole analysis. So finally, just wanted to give a couple of resources. There's kind of an overwhelming amount of stuff out there on the internet for R. So like I mentioned, you can download R in RStudio for free. There's a great book that's free online called R for Data Science. Then the website for that collection of packages I mentioned called the Tidyverse, some cheat sheets, a talk that's kind of provocatively titled, but it sort of covers a lot of what I talked about here more eloquently and in more depth. And then one example of a site online where you can go to find basically answers to pretty much any question that you can think of with R. So that, I think, is it. And I guess, I don't know if we have time for questions, but if there are any.
Do you have any questions? While the mic is getting back there, if you work for the water boards, your staff, we have access to our DIT data center. Software center, and you can get that package onto your computer. While I'm up here, tutorials, you need to learn how to code, right?
Yeah, like I mentioned, it's not quite as complex maybe as some other things where you don't need to be a computer scientist to use it, but you do have to kind of understand some basic coding concepts.
It has a threshold, but it's not a huge one.
Right.
So.
Okay. Just kind of the bring it home question, I guess, is you showed the slides from the data that was generated, and early in the talk you indicated it would also do statistical analysis, I think. So from those charts, do you bring in regression analysis or 95th percentile or other things that we could create new graphics before we publish it?
Yeah, certainly. There's tons and tons of statistics, a lot more than I can even understand. So pretty much anything you can think of, you can do. For this example, I wanted to keep it pretty simple, just to, so I could get through it in the amount of time allotted. But yeah, there's really any kind of statistics. And since it is a programming language, you have a lot of flexibility, so you can really do pretty much any kind of visualization you can think of too.
One more question. Does it also allow you, like in ClickVision or something like that, to create a kind of a dashboard where you can play what-if games kind of thing?
So there is another one of those packages that's called Shiny that lets you build interactive applications that you can put online. So that's certainly available. I'll actually be showing one of those if you're around later today at the end of the day in the main session. But yeah, there's certainly the ability to build interactive type dashboards and things like that.